Hello, everybody, and welcome for the first time to episode 1 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis. I'm a drummer and percussionist based in Nottingham in the UK, and I've worked in the music industry for a long time as a freelance session player, live player, recording drummer, drum teacher, educator, author, composer, and many fancy-sounding titles. But for the past 4 or 5 years, I've really turned my attention to specialise on the snare drum as a solo instrument. I conducted a number of research and composition projects with Arts Council England, where I got to work with some really fantastic people all over the world. I've produced a number of original compositions for the snare drum, including a large collection of technical studies in a book entitled The Snare Drum Virtuoso, after which this podcast is named. So over the course of this series, I'm going to be discussing a number of things pertinent to playing the snare drum as a solo instrument that should hopefully also be of interest to drum kit players and percussionists in general. This podcast gives me a chance to take much more in-depth looks at bigger concepts that are maybe not suitable for the things I usually upload on my YouTube channel. To that end, for people who are interested in what I have to say, in my work, in my publications, in my compositions, you'd be very welcome to visit me at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, or follow my YouTube channel, /jcurtisdrums, which hosts a large collection of lessons and instruction that are a little bit more focused than the sort of things I might discuss on this show, which will be a little bit more conceptual in nature. So over the coming season, I'm going to be discussing conceptual elements of technique, history and traditions of the instrument, repertoire across those different traditions, key historical figures and pedagogical elements. So I hope you'll join me over this season of podcast episodes as we take a deep dive into the snare drum. Now, in the introduction there, we were just hearing the first piece, or the first introduction, the first opening sections of an ensemble piece entitled Jana, which is part of a collection I recently finished for Snare Drum Ensemble. And I'm going to kick things off here by listening to a rudimental piece entitled Modern Syncopation by J. Burns Colby. And this comes from the Nard solo collection, 150 solos of the American tradition, the Nard book. So before we get started, let's have a listen to Modern Syncopation by J. Burns Colby. It's a wonderful piece, that short, sharp, and to the point, and very inspired by the Scottish tradition there, apparent in its use of vocabulary and accents especially. So we're going to kick things off today. I'm going to have a deep dive into this idea of technique and what that means, how we can learn technique, what it means to learn technique, and address some of the potential misunderstandings or misconceptions that many drummers, myself at one point included, may hold about the idea of increasing technique. Because we all want technique, right? We all want to think we are improving technically and we have good technique, or we would like good technique. And it can be often confusing, and often with conflicting information out there about what this actually means. Now, the main source of the topic today that I want to cover is this idea of technique emerging as a response to a need, rather than something that we enforce on our hands prescriptively. Now, this was an idea I was lucky enough to discuss with the great Bob Becker, who is certainly one of my drumming and compositional idols. Bob Becker, for those that don't know, is an American percussionist and composer who was part of a group called Nexus, who performed some wonderful snare drum ensemble pieces. Bob himself has got some great compositions. One of my favorites is called Mudra, which is for snare drum with numerous accompanying parts, marimba and xylophone and taiko drums and everything. It's a wonderful piece. And he has a seminal publication entitled Rudimental Arithmetic, which I think came out in 2008. And when I read this book as part of my research for one of my own topics, one of my own projects, it really changed the way I started to think about phrasing and things on the drums. And I was lucky enough to talk to Bob. He was gracious enough to share some of his time with me and answer my questions and have discussions with me. And we got onto this topic of technique. And I remember asking him, I was learning one of the pieces from his book, Honourable Discharge, I seem to remember, the first etude in his Rudimental Arithmetic book. And I was having a technical trouble. I was having a technical difficulty, some technical trouble with one of the phrases in that piece. And I was asking him about it. And I remember saying, do you find you have a particular way of working on these phrases from a technical aspect? Or do you focus on something else and let the technique emerge? Let the hands figure it out. I think that was my phrase. Do the hands figure it out for themselves? And he said, what an interesting concept. Do the hands figure it out for themselves? So this is really the crux of what I want to talk about today. Now, I want to make two main assertions and then talk about what I mean by these. So the first assertion, or statement, or claim, or hypothesis that I want to make is that technique is predominantly a matter of understanding. Not a physical thing, but a mental thing, an understanding thing, okay? It's very easy to get hung up on the telemetry and the mechanics of how we hold the stick in the hands. Where should the fulcrum be? What the fingers do? Which grip should we use? What's the angle of the thumb? What's the angle of the sticks? And all these really detailed and precise mechanics that I'm not at all convinced really matter that much. For a start, all of our hands are different physiologically. My hands look different to everybody else's. So, of course, my technique is going to look different to everybody else's. What really links, I think, the great technicians, drummers that can play the way they want to play and play the things they want to play, is a deep, innate, familiar understanding of technique, how the fulcrum works, and indeed what a fulcrum is, how the fingers engage to produce the strokes and why that's a good thing, the difference on an intuitive level between the different grip types, why we might consider a French position or a German or American tradition or traditional grip, and what that all means in a very first-hand experiential way, rather than just as an intellectual understanding of, well, yes, they are different grips and it's called this and it's called this. So my first statement is that technique is predominantly a matter of understanding. And secondly, and perhaps following on from this, the idea that technique as progress and improvement comes about as a response to working on the repertoire in a certain way, engagement with the repertoire. And I think that's really important. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to a lot throughout this chat. So let's talk about what I mean by both of these to begin with. First of all, technique as understanding. Well, let's take a thought experiment. Let's say I am here in the studio with one of my young students, 13 years old, been playing for a year or so, maybe grade 1 or grade 2, and they have burgeoning technique. They're learning things for the first time. They may not be experienced with any repertoire. They may have never seen or learned a drum solo or a percussion solo or anything like that. And they're learning things for the first time. And let's take me as the experienced teacher who's been playing for decades and has been playing professionally and all sorts of things. Now, we would consider quite a large gulf between our respective techniques. If we were to directly compare their technique with my technique, we would say, of course, there is a big gap that comes down to how long we've been playing and practice and experience and all these things. So as a thought experiment, what happens if we were to give me a 2-year hiatus? Let's say I put down the sticks for 2 years and I don't play at all. Maybe within that time I keep teaching, I keep writing, and I keep engaged with the instrument, but at no point within those 2 years do I actually pick up a drumstick. well, of course, we would expect my technique to become extremely rusty. I would lose my edge, I would not be gig fit, and I certainly would not be progressing or improving. So what happens now if we were to compare me to that same student? Well, we wouldn't suddenly say that I am now working at the same level as them technically. That would seem wrong. And I think the reason that seems wrong is because all of my accumulated experience and expertise and knowledge results in a deep understanding of what I'm doing, what the sticks are doing, how the sticks move within the hand, how the hands control the sticks to produce the stroke that my student still lacks. Even if they'd been playing steadily for 2 years and improving, there would still be that gulf in understanding and experience firsthand, regardless of the fact that I might be physically rusty. So one of the things I always try to get my students to think about is this idea of understanding the fundamentals of a grip, the fundamentals of strokes and techniques, so that they can figure out what's comfortable for them. We often hear in the community, in the drumming community, debates about where a fulcrum should be. For example, should the fulcrum be on the first finger? Should the fulcrum be on the middle finger? Does that matter? Is one superior to the other? And I think this misunderstands the question, because I think the issue is not where the fulcrum is. I think the issue is, do we have a fulcrum? And do we understand what that fulcrum is supposed to do? By fulcrum, I mean the part of the hand that actually holds the stick. We can think of a bicycle wheel, which has got the frame holding an axle in the center of the wheel, and that wheel rotates around that central point. Or we might think of a seesaw and the point at which the seesaw rocks back and forth. These we consider to be fulcrums, pivot points. Well, we need one of those when we're holding a drumstick, because when we do a stroke, the energy of the stroke causes the stick to rebound, and that rebounding stick kind of rotates around the fulcrum point. So far more important of where the fulcrum is that we have one and that we know what it is supposed to do. And the number of times I've had students come to me with some technical qualms, and the first thing I notice is that they don't have a fulcrum. Maybe their thumb is coming off the stick, or their index finger is coming off the stick at the point of the stroke, and they are actually giving up the fulcrum they had when they started. So there's no wonder that they can't produce their singles and double strokes as well as they would like, because they've got rid of one of the core elements of the technique, which is the fulcrum. Likewise, with the fingers, we can debate forever about how the fingers are used. We can debate about the role of the fingers in terms of the rotation of the wrists. Should we be playing the fingers only in a French position, or how do we employ the fingers in a German position and whatnot? But far more important than that is that we understand that we need the fingers to engage to produce the stroke. What's the role of the wrist? All these elements that need to synergize to produce a stroke that we need to understand on a conceptual level. And I think when you have that conceptual understanding, it doesn't really matter which grip we choose to use. It doesn't really matter how long we may go without playing and getting a little bit rusty. As long as we retain that understanding, we're in good stead. And we can pick up the physical aspect again relatively arbitrarily. Now, the question then becomes, well, how do we attain this understanding? It's all very well and good talking about the rhetorical side. How do we attain this understanding? What does this actually mean? Well, a large portion of this is, of course, experience. Having an experienced teacher is very, very helpful to point us in the right direction. But perhaps the most important thing, and this kind of brings me to the second point, and this is the main crux of my ideas today that I want to talk about, is this idea of working with repertoire, working with musical pieces and solo pieces that require good technique, and allowing our own technique to develop in response to that. And this is what gives rise to the understanding that I'm talking about. And I have to be clear here. When I talk about understanding, I'm not talking about analytical understanding. I'm not talking about the ability to explain to somebody what the difference is between French and American grip or traditional grip. I'm not talking about the ability to explain what the fulcrum is. I'm talking about that first-hand experience of knowing what it feels like. Knowing what it feels like to hold the fulcrum firmly so the stick rotates around it. Knowing what it feels like, what it actually means on a physical level as the person experiencing it and doing it, and executing it, what it actually means for the fingers to engage to produce a double stroke roll. I can explain to somebody how to drive a car, how to change gears, how to operate the pedals, but until they're the ones in the driver's seat and they get a sense for what that feels like, they don't fully understand. So that's what I'm talking about here. So what do I mean then when I talk about engagement with the repertoire, engagement with material in a certain way that gives rise to understanding? And often to the chagrin of many of my students, I often turn them away from exercises. Many students are perfectly happy to take exercise on the pad, take paradiddles at 60 BPM and play that for 20 minutes on the pad ad nauseum, and still become frustrated when they can't play paradiddles the way they would like. So I often direct students away from exercises and I get them learning pieces. So what's going on here? Well, the idea with a piece of music is that there is an end result, right? This is the purpose for which we learn the instrument. Any instrument, we want to play pieces of music, notwithstanding improvisation, of course. But for our current purposes, we want to learn to play music, whether this is a John Pratt solo or whether it's anything else. We have this idea of what we want that music to sound like. And this has to be the determining factor. This has to be the benchmark against which we judge our performance. And as an expansion of that, against which we judge our technique. Because how do we judge whether technique is good or bad? Well, either it works or it doesn't. If my technique enables me to perform the thing I want to perform, then my technique is good. It does not matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter whether it's orthodox or unorthodox, whether it follows a particular doctrine of you must have your middle finger as the fulcrum. It doesn't matter. If you can produce the piece you are trying to play and it sounds the way you want it to sound, then your technique is good. So this is the only metric against which we can meaningfully judge and benchmark our technique. So, of course, we have to start with a piece in mind. We have to start with a piece of music in mind against which we can judge our progress. Now, when we are faced with learning a piece of music, especially for the first time, many students of mine are simply inexperienced when it comes to learning pieces of the repertoire, traditional, modern, or otherwise, that they run into big problems straight away. They run into problems with reading the rhythm and recognizing the figures. They certainly run into technical problems of producing the strokes and producing all of the figures within that. And all of this compounds into a sense of hopelessness where they revert to their safety net, which is to go away and practice exercise as a preparatory step. So I see in the first bar of this piece, there's a big 9-stroke roll at 120 BPM. Well, I can't do that, so I'd better go away and practice my double strokes for 6 years and wonder why they become frustrated that they're never getting anywhere, that they're not improving their double strokes. And it's because there's no application, there's no judge, no benchmark against which they can judge their progress. So what I'm going to do is take an example here and show you how we might work on a piece from the perspective of somebody trying to improve their technique in a really dedicated way. Because what I really want to put across here is this idea that when we are working on a piece, especially one we can't play, the technique, the correct, quote unquote, the correct technique emerges as a response to the needs of that piece. So I'm using a Joe Tompkins piece here that I'm working on at the moment from one of his early collections called 8 Rudimental Drum Solos, and it's a piece called Rudimental Rondo. And it's a lovely piece. There's lots of interesting contemporary rudimental vocabulary in there and a few parts that are a nice technical challenge for us to work on. Now I'm going to take the opening 2 measures. Now very slowly, they sound like this. We've got this interesting phrase. Now, the tempo is much faster than that. We're aiming to play this around 110 BPM, which is very, very quick. But we've got a lot of elements here that need to come together before we even think about playing this at 110. One of the big things we have to think about, of course, is the roll. There are 2 big rolls in there, which for reference are 11-stroke rolls. And we also have to think about the combination of rhythms, the flams, and crucially, the accents and the taps. Now, throughout this phrase, there are accented flams and there are unaccented flams. There are accented single strokes, there are unaccented single strokes, and there are double stroke rolls, these two 11-stroke rolls that we hear at the beginning and the end of the phrase. Now, this is a perfect environment to cultivate technique. So let's imagine we are a student and we are learning this piece for the first time, and we are hoping to improve our technique because of this, through this method. Now, as I say, the whole underlying goal here is to allow the correct technique to emerge, to improve our understanding as a response to the needs in the piece. So let's take the first measure here. I know you can't see this, so you'll have to bear with me because it's the concept that's more important than the specifics. But the first measure here starts with a big 11-stroke roll. Now, this 11-stroke roll takes place within the span of 1/4 note, which means there's a specific 5-note subdivision. So the underlying rhythm is 5/16 notes followed by an accent. And then we need to double each of those 5/16 notes to create the 11-stroke roll. Now, there is the added complication of that 11-stroke roll itself being accented. So we've got this accented 11-stroke roll with a specific underlying subdivision, and then we've got the accent that follows before we've even got to the rest of the figure and the flams. The first thing we have to say here, or that we have to ask here, is what is the intention of the composer? What's Joe Tompkins trying to express with this figure, with these accents? So as I say, if we break away the roll and we start with just the 5-note figure, we've got an accent at the beginning and the accent at the end. This is just the bare bones of the figure before we even reinsert that 11-stroke roll. Notice we've got an accent at the beginning and an accent at the end. So even just performing this, in order for me to clearly hear the correct rhythm, the correct phrase as intended by the composer, I have to be able to clearly delineate between the accented strokes and the unaccented strokes, and I also have to clearly articulate this slightly unusual quintuple rhythm. So I'm not just playing, but I'm accenting in the required places. So even just on this initial early deconstruction of the very first beat of the bar, I've got to make sure I'm clearly articulating a 5-note rhythm, and I'm clearly differentiating between an accent and a tap, because I've got the accent at the beginning of the roll and I've got the accent at the end of the roll. So as a student, I need to be looking at my hands and looking at how I produce an accent. What do my hands need to do? What does the stick need to do in order to produce an accent? Well, generally speaking, we play a stroke from a greater height in order to produce a louder stroke. So let's limit ourselves here to 2 stick heights, vertical for accents and horizontal for taps, which we'll call the unaccented strokes. So I'm playing 6 notes here, and I need the first and the last of those to be accented. So both of those notes, both of those strokes need to be played from a greater stick height than the taps in between. So I need to make sure my hands and the stick are moving in such a way that allows for a great enough contrast to hear that accent. Now, a common error here is to not have a big enough difference, a clear enough distinction between the stick heights. So we might get something like this. The accents are there, but they're just not differentiated enough against the underlying taps. So we get this sense of honing in on a particular weakness in technique and saying the technique is not performing as to what is needed by the piece, because we need this. Not where there's no differentiation between the accents and the taps. So we've now got a very specific goal in mind. I need to perform 6 strokes, the first and the last of which are accented, and I need the interim notes to be completely horizontal. So what do I need to do to perform an accent and then keep the subsequent strokes controlled enough that the rhythm retains its articulation, but low enough that they're unaccented and they're clearly differentiated from the accents? Well, this is to do with the fingers and the fulcrum. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it now because that's not the point. The idea is that the student has to figure out, like solving a puzzle, finding the solution to a puzzle, the correct choreography, the correct sequence of movements and pressures and stroke types to produce that very simple but very important phrase. 5 evenly spaced notes, beginning with an accent and culminating with a 6th accented stroke. So even at a very slow tempo, if we can get to the point where we are performing this, we've made a great start, and we've improved our understanding as a response to the requirements of the piece. Now, we can expand outwards from here. We know that we need to revert to that 11-stroke roll, so our 5 strokes at the beginning prior to the accent need to be doubled. And I need to now work out, how do I retain the accent? How do I retain the 5-note rhythm, but insert clean, articulated double strokes? Well, I need to figure that out, right? That's a puzzle that needs solving. So now I'm looking at my fingers, I'm looking at my fulcrum, and when I say looking at, I mean really examining, yes, with my eyes, but also with what it feels like, with different pressures, with different positions of the stick within the fulcrum. I'm experimenting, I'm exploring. What does it feel like if I have a middle finger fulcrum instead? How does that affect my ability to control the double strokes? How does it affect my ability to control the accents or the taps? How does that change if I move over and rotate into a French position? How does that change if I use traditional grip? All of these things need to be understood intuitively and personally, experientially. So I try it. The student tries it, right? What happens if I do this? What happens if I try to produce these double strokes with my wrists only, right? If I don't use my fingers, well, we'll quickly find that that's almost impossible. We can't produce these double strokes without our fingers. So we then start saying, well, what do my fingers need to do? What happens if I use this drop catch method? What happens if I use a molar-esque whip for the accents? How does this affect my follow-up strokes? All of these questions, as I say, that allow us to explore and to gradually better understand the mechanics of sticks in hand, stroke types, in response, this is the crucial point, as I say, in response to the needs of the piece. Now, following this roll, we have 2 unaccented flams, followed by accented strokes. So we have this. There's a phrase there forming. It doesn't sound particularly special on my pad, but again, it's illustrating a point for us here. Now, for a lot of students, coming across an unaccented flam is another problematic point, because many people are very used to producing flams with an accent. We like these very big accented flams. So I see many students, when faced with unaccented flams, furrow their brows and scratch their heads going, well, how do I produce a flam that's not accented? Because as we know, in order to produce a flam, we need to have contrasting stick heights. One stick needs to be higher than the other. So surely this is going to give rise to an accent. Well, yes, it is. It is. A flam is always going to be perceived as an emphasis point within a wider rhythm, but that doesn't mean we should further add to that with a dedicated accent. So again, the student is faced with this task, this puzzle of how do we produce an unaccented flam within the rhythm, within the time constraints, within the tempo, differentiate it clearly enough from the surrounding accents, have a clearly articulated flam. What do my fingers need to do? I'm repeating myself now, but I think this illustrates the main point. Now, as you work through a piece in this manner, 3 things happen, which are very important. 3 really beneficial things happen. The first is that you learn a great deal about how technique works, about how the sticks move in the hands, about how the fingers control the sticks. You learn a great deal about that. Secondly, you increase your understanding of technique in general. You learn a great deal about general principles, about the fulcrum, about the fingers that you may not have known before. And thirdly, and this is often understated in its importance, you're actually learning genuine repertoire. You're learning genuine pieces of music that you can then go on to play or absorb into your own improvisational vocabulary. So you may have never encountered, a student may never have encountered an 11-stroke roll before in the space of a quarter note. So they're now exposed to this rhythmic idea that they simply didn't know was possible. They'd never explored it before. They'd never encountered it before. And that in itself is very, very valuable. So this process involves learning technique at the point of the musical application itself. So sitting there at a pad for hours playing paradiddles is all well and good until you come across a paradiddle in a piece of music with a very specific application and a very specific rhythm and transitioning in from one figure and transitioning into another. And you suddenly realize that those relentless paradiddle drills you've been practicing haven't really served you very well at all, because simply playing paradiddles, often mindlessly for hours on end, is not teaching you any of this. Whereas we may have a phrase, I don't know, a typical rudimental phrase, sees a paradiddle tie into a flamacue. And suddenly we're faced with the same problem that we have with learning our piece. We've got this very particular application of a figure, an idea, a phrase, a rudiment that we thought we knew in a manner that we've never encountered before. And suddenly, as I say, all of those countless repetitions of just paradiddles are not serving us, because we need to hear the accents, we need to hear the rhythm, we need to hear the unaccented flam of the flamacue coming in from the diddle of the paradiddle. And if you've never done that before, it's very difficult to do that. You have to learn how to do that. So this really means that ultimately genuine technical progress is going to come from meaningful engagement with the repertoire. Learning pieces, learning musical pieces, and allowing the technique to emerge as a response to the musical needs of those pieces. Because if you're trying to learn a piece and you are not paying attention to the dynamics, the rhythm, the accents, then you're not playing the piece. You're just going through the motions on a superficial level. To really perform these pieces as they need to be performed, the rhythms need to be articulated, the accents need to be clearly distinguished, the dynamics need to be followed closely to express the main musical idea of the composer, hence playing music, right? So from my experience as somebody who, as a younger drummer, practiced relentlessly on a pad and still found myself very frustrated at the idea of my technique not working for me. What I realized after having some lessons with some very knowledgeable and exceptional players, that I wasn't working with any musical material. I'd never played Delacluse. I'd never played Cerrone or Mitchell Peters. I'd never played Pratt or Will Coxon. Well, I had in my younger days, but I'd never sort of got on with it too well because it was really difficult. So what I found is once I went back and started exploring these pieces from a much more musical perspective, and I allowed myself to essentially start from the bottom and build up my hands, not because of what I thought they should be doing, not in a way that I thought they should be doing, but in a way that actually allowed me to play the pieces, my understanding increased and my technique improved because of that. Now, the book after which this podcast is named, The Snare Drum Virtuoso, embodies this concept because it consists of something like 72, 76, I can't remember, 70 odd technical studies that are designed in two ways. The first way in which they are designed is that they are supposed to be musical pieces in their own right. I really didn't want these to be exercises. So I generally, they can be called études because they are musical pieces with an educational aspect, but they are intended to be musical pieces first and foremost. But from the educational aspect, they are written in a way that specializes or focuses on or requires certain techniques to be well developed. So there might be a chapter on double strokes where the studies require strong double stroke technique in order to play them. This means if you don't have strong double stroke technique, you can't play the pieces. How do you get strong double technique? You learn the piece. It's kind of this cyclical thing. You develop strong double stroke technique by working on a piece of music that requires strong double stroke technique, all the while paying attention to the things that I've talked about so far, the accents, the dynamics, the rhythm, the stroke types, trying to expand our understanding, as I say. So this was really my main driving idea when I wrote the book, and it's the way that I practice today. I very rarely practice exercises now, only when I'm really trying to explore the foundational movements, mechanics of a stroke type to make sure there's no underlying issue. Generally speaking, like I'm working on this piece, Rudimental Rondo, at the moment, I work on the piece and I allow my technique to improve as a response to that. And I have had great success in doing that. So, if you are listening to this and you are wondering how you can apply this to your own playing, I would strongly encourage you to just press pause for now on any exercises and dedicated pad drills you may be doing, and maybe open one of the repertoire books or get yourself a repertoire book. It doesn't matter what it is, from Delacluse to Pratt or anything else. Open the page, look at the solo, and start learning that solo and allow your technique to develop as a response to that. And I think that will stand you in far better stead in the long run, in the longer term, than another round of half an hour of paradiddles on the pad. Now, I think I'm going to leave it there because if I keep going, I risk repeating myself ad nauseum. But I can't stress enough the value of learning technique at the point of application, learning it through the repertoire. So, to close out here, we've been talking about Joe Tompkins, so let's close with a Joe Tompkins piece. In a moment, I'm going to show you another Joe Tompkins piece from the same collection. This piece is called Tuesdays at 4. But before I do, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. As I've said, if you enjoy what you're hearing here, you can find out more about me, my books, my compositions, and indeed lessons at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk. You can find a wealth of videos, instructional and conceptual videos, pedagogical videos on my YouTube channel at J Curtis Drums, or indeed Facebook as well at J Curtis Drums. And I would love for some of you to stop by, say hello, and just get in touch for a chat. So I hope you've enjoyed today. I'll see you next time on episode 2 of the Snare Drum Virtuoso. And to close, here is Joe Tompkins, Tuesdays at 4. Thank you very much.